Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Or buenos dias, because I think we're going to be talking about Mexico a bit in this session. If we can just take our seats, we'll get started. Okay, thank you. Welcome back again. This is after another great session this morning. Good to be back here. Again, as usual, I'm going to do a bit of the boring stuff first. Can I just remind everybody about the evaluation forms which are in front of you? At some point today, before you leave, please hand them in to us. We do have a prize draw at the end of the day for some nice tin of premium English biscuits. That's cookies in American, I believe. So yeah, it's not the southern version, I'm afraid, with gravy and things. That would be nice. We'll look into that for next year. So anyway, please, again, your feedback is really important to us, so do take the time. You know, the supply chain is often about reacting to change, being flexible. Unexpected things happen, you have to be ready for them. And I think automotive logistics, we try to follow the same principle. We did have a change on your printed program with the gentleman from General Motors who couldn't be here, but we've managed to bring on board, you know, even bigger and better. We're very pleased to have some panelists join us at quite short notice, and we're very, very lucky to have them here. So obviously, yesterday we heard some of the developments from PwC. We know that the market continues to grow, fortunately, and production, in particular, is slated to grow perhaps even more than sales over the coming years. The figure we heard yesterday was another 2.7 million units of production between 2014 and 2021 in North America, coming close to 20 million. A lot of that is going to come out of Mexico, which, you know, depending on the latest forecast or the latest announcement, it's hard to keep up with everybody, you know, entering there or expanding, but, you know, heading towards the 5 million mark in production probably by the end of the decade. So obviously that's a lot of change that brings. It's not just Mexico, and I don't think we're just going to be talking about Mexico here. Obviously, the example of Volvo building a new plant, plenty of expansion in the south. Nissan is another example. So, you know, we're seeing changes in the U.S. as well. More export, anticipate, that was another prediction we're seeing, both out of the U.S. and out of Mexico, of course. Not just intra-North America, but globally. And that's why we're fortunate that we'll have Charles Franklin from Honda giving us some perspective on that side. But obviously with these sort of changes, we obviously have network issues, infrastructure deficits, rail capacity, cross-border issues with Mexico. Security is certainly a theme that I'm sure we'll address. And right here in the US, we were reminded yesterday about you know, the need to invest in our ports, perhaps having been traditionally on the import side for a long time, you know, how well suited are our facilities for export and handling those services. I think I heard a statistic last year, the US will add something like 70 million people over the next 30 or 40 years to the population. And so basically the whole nation of Germany absorbed. I think I pointed out that it's not actually via conquest. It's actually a natural, it'll be a natural evolution here, but, you know, and do we have the infrastructure to match that? You know, I mean, you can be a little discouraged probably if you follow news out of Washington and trying to get highway authorization bills and funding over the long term approved and haven't, you know, seen so much progress on that. There's sort of issues that are going to affect this industry as well, and how we obviously have to push. That's me getting a bit too close to the mic again. I was told yesterday that my P's and B's kind of explode off of the mic because I get a bit too close. So sorry, I'll soften my consonants or step back a bit. Yeah, anyway, so we have to push on the lobbying side, but also be prepared, use the network more intelligently in our logistic engineering, in our planning, in our IT. And so looking at those changing dynamics and what they mean. So with that in mind, I'm very pleased for the panel that we've been able to put before you today to discuss that. We'll first have a presentation from Charles Franklin, who's the manager of export logistics at Honda. Scott Mize is joining us again. Thanks for the last minute. He, I think, learned about it 15 minutes ago. He'll be joining as a panelist. Scott Mize is Senior Manager of Purchasing and Transport Logistics at Renault-Nissan, and of course has lots to do, I'm sure, with all the growth out of Mexico at the moment. Jason Steele is Assistant Vice President of Automotive for Union Pacific Railroad, and Gary Salvador, who's the Senior VP Sales and Marketing at AMPORTS. So we'll have 3 presentations. Scott will join us for the Q&A, and we look forward to having a good, lively discussion. So first, I'd like to invite Charles from Honda.
All righty, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I'll try not to put you to sleep, but sticking with the title, Changing Dynamics, a little bit more than 15 minutes. So if you see typos or something in the slides, it's because I made them about 30 minutes ago, okay? So, but at any rate, it's kind of interesting, the dynamics, and I'm going to start with a brief video, very brief. I hit the button. Do I have to point it somewhere?
Today, Honda is proud to be a leading U.S. manufacturer and exporter of U.S.-made automobiles, currently including more than 40 countries in South and Central America, Africa, and Europe. From the first Accord to the 1 millionth, each vehicle is built with the original Honda mindset. Quality for the world.
And I showed that because just for Honda, that is a changing dynamic as itself. Initially, when Honda began manufacturing in North America, it was for North American consumption. And this year, and actually last year, we will export more vehicles than Japan. And in fact, we're going to export over 115,000 vehicles off the North American continent this year, using some of you guys in the room to do many parts of that. And it's amazing because we do our business plans based on the fact that we know you can do it. So without hesitation, without fear, we say, can you do it? I say, oh yeah. And that's before I talk to any of you, but I know I'm going to put it on a train, a truck, a vessel, or something, and I know that when they say the ETA is B, then I'm going to get it there on B. And so thank you for that support. And please don't make a liar out of me. Now, continuing with the change, and I'm going to speak to Honda. You know, I'm from Southern California, and here it's all about me. So I'm going to speak about this dynamic as it pertains to me and Honda. And so if you look at this organizational chart, this is just our export logistics or export sales division, really. And if you looked at this just 3 years ago, it would have been only 1/3 of that. So because of the growth of export from the continent, our division is continually growing. And not only because of the volume, but the complexity. Now, this slide is representative of what we normally would look at as far as logistics in North America. And you say, okay, we got plants, and we take them to the ports. Now, I'm not talking about the domestic piece. I'm talking about as it pertains to exports. The export guys, the domestic guys who I think you may hear from later today, their North American map would be a bit more complicated than mine, but I'm usually just trying to get them to the ports so I can get them to the rest of the world. And then we would look here, which looks a little more complicated, but not really. You get it to the port, and again, my partners, most of you in the room, get them to the destinations for us. The way that has changed, a big change, just last September 1st, we took over export for our new plant in Mexico. And so what that means is we want them to focus on producing the best products and not worry about how they get to where they're going. And so last September, we took over, and my assistant manager and myself actually flew to Mexico for the first shipment. And it's kind of interesting with those dynamics because even though Mexico is our partner, we own them, it's 100% Honda, they weren't 100% on board with us taking over their logistics. They're like, what are you guys doing, coming down here telling us what to do? So literally, Michael and I went down there and pretty much shoved these cars on a train. Now, with that new dynamic, we talked to one of our suppliers who will remain nameless. Our folks in Mexico talked to one of our suppliers in Mexico, and we said, do you have enough capacity to move our vehicles? And they said yes to both of us, thinking that we were talking about the same vehicles. So when Michael and I get to Mexico, they said, oh, no, we only have enough for one. So basically, we wound up stealing transportation from our own company. But again, we had to wrestle with our supplier, and they found some more capacity, and actually we broke a record that day getting the vehicles out of there. So, and we're actually flying there Sunday, probably to do it again with our new shipments going to Europe for the first time out of Mexico. But as you can see, all of that didn't exist just a few years ago. So that's a huge dynamic for us and for you. Now, what happens for us, like I said, effective last September, we took over Mexico export. And so with that, this year, we will export more out of Mexico than we do out of the U.S. And that comes with a whole host of challenges. First of all, we got to find out all the trade agreements and restrictions between all these various countries that is all brand new to us, and something that we're dealing with right now, Mexico being a brand new operation and not having exported off of the continent before. The processors weren't set up to do port repairs, so there's no system in place to get them parts. And so you won't believe how difficult it is to get a windshield. You know, and then you have to make sure, now I'm sending this windshield there and I'm getting it installed, do I have to disclose that to the destination? So every day with all of this, our dynamics are changing. And then we're looking at the vandalism, particularly in Mexico, which in the U.S. we don't really have to worry about. But it's amazing. We have to calculate what percentage of our vehicles are not going to get to the port. Or they'll get to the port, but they're not going to be shippable. And so that's another dynamic. And so now we look at, okay, would it be better for me to short sea this vehicle, instead of railing it? Would it be better to truck it instead of railing it? Then you do the calculations on what is the most likely way to get your vehicle, even though it might not be the most cost effective, but you can say I might get a whole car to the vessel on time. And so it's an interesting dynamic. And in fact, just moments ago, we're on a call because some hail damaged vehicles are on their way to Mexico. And so Mexico's worried about, okay, if they cross the border, now they're my cars, who's going to fix the hail damage? And so we're partnering, actually somebody's in the room who's going to help us with that. But it's an interesting dynamic with the logistics, not only in North America, but how that logistics impacts the rest of the world. So with that, I won't bore you any further, but I thank you for your patience, and I hope it made a little bit of sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I don't think you've bored any of us, actually, so we really appreciate that. Very honest presentation and sort of just putting out some of the challenges and a brand new operation for the company. So look forward to talking more in the question and answer. Next up, I'd like to invite railroad representation to discuss the changing dynamics. So Jason Steele from Union Pacific.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak here today, and I appreciate those of you that stayed around for the last afternoon here. I was joking with the guys earlier that our pitching coach is really tired because I've gone to the bullpen a lot here. So in order to fill the last little bit before lunch, I've got 80 slides. We're going to burn through them. No, I got a really short 10 minutes. So again, thank you. My name is Jason Steele. I'm the Assistant Vice President, Automotive for Union Pacific. And I've really appreciated the last couple days listening to all the panelists and speakers talk about the supply chain, because I do think it's important that we continue this dialogue, the entire supply chain all the way through, because no one piece of the supply chain is going to fix and handle the growth and the infrastructure that's needed. So today, I'm not going to go through that. Specifically today, I was asked to talk about the growth in Mexico and what Union Pacific specifically is doing to handle that growth as we move forward. Big green one. So I thought I'd start with a look at global production. Chris did a great job on his entry. They really hit all of these numbers that you're seeing on here that we walked through. There's no surprise to anyone here. If you look at the 6 dots represented on this chart by that Global Insight put out, this is the 6 major demand regions in the world. These 6 regions make up about 80% of the world's production last year for finished vehicles. The blue dot is the 2015 estimated production. The orange, or the light colored dot, is what's estimated by 2022. No surprise, the growth in China. We're not going to talk about that. Again, we're going to focus today on what North America looks like. But I do think it's important to look at the changing dynamic that we've talked about the last couple days. You see the shrink in production in Korea and Japan, and the growth in North America, predominantly driven by Mexico. What that's going to do is fundamentally change the way the supply chain works. So from railroads to trucking companies to all logistics companies, transportation companies, you're going to have to re-engineer your network to now handle less imports and more growth out of Mexico. That changes distribution of multi-levels. Heard a lot about multi-levels the last couple days. So that's nothing that we're not familiar with. It's nothing that we don't handle and deal with every day, and we're going to continue to focus on that. But it is something worth looking at. So if you specifically drive into North America, again, Mexico is predicted to grow to almost 5 million vehicles production by the end of the decade. Chris did a great job when he set that up in the beginning. 80% of Mexico's vehicles last year produced were exported. They're the 7th largest auto manufacturer in the world, and they're the 2nd largest supplier of vehicles to the United States, and I think the general thought is that that'll change as well by the end of the decade. The right-hand side shows you the chart as you look at that, the vehicles produced. The bottom is just something we threw together when you look at it, and it shows what's happened over the last 10 years in North America. So while I'm specifically going to focus on Mexico, it is important to note the plants that have come online in the Southeast. Just doesn't include the Volvo announcement that Chris mentioned earlier. But it does talk about all the public announcements that have been made in Mexico for vehicle production facilities, as well as large transmission or engine facilities in Mexico. And that was represented on the bottom right side of the chart. So from a railroad's perspective, that's important in automotive production and the shift, but it's even bigger to look at what's going on in Mexico broader, so more global. So what's happening in Mexico? Well, the GDP in Mexico from 2014 to 2016 is supposed to grow by about 1.5 points. Industrial production over that same time period is expected to grow almost 2%. So from a railroad standpoint, that's important because we don't just focus on automotive, we focus on a number of commodities. And it's a supply chain, and we're using a fixed, basically, supply chain and railroad to handle all different commodities into and out of Mexico. So if you move forward and look at the Union Pacific network, automotive is a very critical part of the Union Pacific network. Represents about 10% of our total book of business. We're dedicated to the automotive business, but we also have to keep in mind not only automotive forecasting and changes and production changes, but what's happening with every commodity. So what's happening with grain, steel, rock, sand, chemicals, changes in global dynamics, demand, and growth in Mexico. So if you look at here on this network, what I wanted to highlight is Union Pacific operates in 23 states west of the Mississippi. We have roughly 32,000 miles of track. We connect with all major West Coast ports, and we have interchanges with both Canadian railroads, both Eastern railroads. If you start looking at automotive, and specifically Mexico, we have 6 interchanges into Mexico that we use all 6 actively for all different commodities. The only railroad in North America that has those 6 interchanges into and out of Mexico. Specifically, automotive distribution centers, the little circles represent our automotive distribution centers for Union Pacific. Again, we hit every major metropolitan area west of the Mississippi for vehicle distribution. So why is that important? We believe our network that we have in place in North America and distribution centers, we're constantly evaluating them. We're in a great position to handle the vehicles into the destination markets. So as we're focusing on the growth in Mexico, and we look at the franchise that we have, we feel like it's set up very well to handle the growth, but we know we have to improve it. We know we have to put money into that franchise. So what have we done? I'm going to tell you about what we're going to do, but it's important to start with what has been done. This chart here represents the last 10 years of capital investment back into our network. It's been a consistent and steady investment. We've put about $32 billion back into our network for the last 10 years. If you took this chart back another 7 years prior to that, you'd see the same consistent level of capital investment back into the railroad. In fact, if you looked at that 17-year period and specifically drilled into automotive, we've put about almost $1 billion into our auto franchise over the last 17 years. We're dedicated to the automotive business. We have been for a long time. We're going to continue to invest in that. So what did that $1 billion go to? It went to multi-levels. Union Pacific owns about 26% of the national fleet of multi-levels. It went to our infrastructure. It went into our facilities, cameras, security, lighting, pavement. The ultimate goal is to move your vehicles to market faster and safe. Safety is a huge priority for any railroad, no different for Union Pacific, no different than for any other manufacturer. We won't compromise on safety, and we'll continue to invest to make sure that we're moving vehicles safely across our network. So before I move on, if you look on the right-hand side, the one piece I didn't talk about is I'm going to dive in here a little bit, is specifically what are we doing at Union Pacific. So if you start a little globally across our network, this chart is kind of an eye chart for a lot of you, and I recognize that. What I wanted to highlight is where the money is going. So Tara mentioned yesterday, I think she used the term turn the lights on. At railroads, we use that term all the time. So what does that mean? Well, of our $4.2 billion announced capital spend this year. About $1.9 billion is to turn the lights on. Again, we have a 32,000-mile outdoor factory. We need to make sure that that factory is constantly running. We harden the infrastructure, and we're moving rail cars safely across our network. So about $1.9 billion is going to go to that. The remaining money is all going into growth and productivity. So the growth and productivity can be terminal expansions, technology, freight cars, locomotives, and all of that goes into the network. So I could go into all the detail. What I really wanted to hit on here is if you look at this map on the left-hand side, each star that you see on there is a terminal that's going to get a capital improvement this year with the $4.2 billion that we have out. The lines that have the yellow highlight around them are the corridors that are going to get the infrastructure improvement with our $4.2 billion this year. We are heavily focusing our capital investment on our franchise into and out of Mexico, as well as the growth in the southern region. Why is that important? We just talked about it. We know there's going to be a shift in vehicle production. We know there's increased commodities going into and out of Mexico, and we recognize the need to improve that infrastructure. So on the right-hand side of the chart, there's not an inclusive list, but it just kind of walks through the list of projects that are going to help in Mexico. So when it says Sunset Route, that probably doesn't mean a lot to most of you out there. What that is, that is a double track that we're putting in from El Paso, Texas to Southern California Basin. Basically anything coming out of Mexico or across the network over El Paso to go west. That project's been in place for a number of years, and we're happy to announce that we're continuing that investment to double track that line. We've done border improvements at Nogales, Laredo, and Eagle Pass, and we're going to continue to do that again this year and into next year as well. What's that mean? We've increased the weight that can be moved over those gateways. We've put support tracks in to be able to make the interchanges more fluid so trains aren't locked up on the bridge. We've continued investment in our Port Laredo intermodal facility so that way we have other options and outlets for Mexico as well. So it's not just trains coming over the border. There's an option to relieve some of the congestion. We work very closely with both Mexican railroads to ensure that the capital investments we're doing are in line with what they're doing to make sure the infrastructure is built up on both sides of the border. I can't speak for what's happening south of the border, but I can tell you what we're doing on the north side of the border is preparing for growth. Santa Teresa Intermodal Terminal. You might be asking, this is a finished vehicle logistics conference. Why are we talking about intermodal? That facility does handle parts for most of your facilities into and out of the Santa Teresa area, which is just outside of El Paso in New Mexico. But the other thing we did there is we put a locomotive fueling terminal in. And that's important to all of you because it enabled us now basically to have a point where north, south, east, and west trains can go through, be refueled, serviced, and move back on the network more fluid and across any direction. It's very important. It was a new facility last year. It opened last year. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, I'd invite all of you to at least go out and look at it if you're in the area, El Paso area. It's pretty impressive. Last thing I'm going to talk about is in Hearne, Texas. So last year, for those of you that missed it, Union Pacific announced that we were going to be building a new classification yard in southern Robertson County. We have 7 lines that converge in southern Robertson County just outside of Hearne, which is where the new terminal is going to be built. This classification facility is the first classification yard that's been built on the UP line in decades. And frankly, it will be decades longer probably before we see another one. These are incredibly capital-intensive projects that take years of planning, a lot of land, and dedication basically to the business. So this is our commitment that we recognize that Mexico is growing. We recognize the need for improved throughput at the border, and we're going to build a facility to handle that. So what does this mean? This facility is going to create about 1,400 jobs in Robertson County for the construction of the facility. It'll create 200 jobs, full-time jobs, once the yard is open and employees are working at it. And it's going to, at full production, once the facility is open, and we're not giving a specific date for that facility to be open yet. It's still several years out, although construction has started. The facility will be able to handle 2,500 rail cars a day through the facility. 2,500 cars a day. That's an enormous amount of rail cars. And what it's going to do is going to pull rail cars out of all of our other terminals in Mexico and be able to switch them at that facility. It'll build trains for the Southeast United States, the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and the Southwest. We'll basically be able to bring cars into this terminal, switch them, build trains, and send them directly to market. Not just for automotive, but again for all commodities. So what this will also do is increase the fluidity at the border. So now we don't have to do work around the border. We can just send trains across the border directly into this facility and then work them. It's a huge commitment for Union Pacific. on the growth in Mexico. It's a huge commitment to be able to handle all of your vehicles and your products, whether it be vehicles or auto parts, frankly, safer, more efficiently, and get them to market faster. So in conclusion, we recognize there's global production changes. We're not disagreeing with that. We agree with everything we've heard over the last couple of days. We also recognize that North America is going to be a driver to that. I do like to remind everyone to step back and look at the global, not just automotive, but everything that's going on in Mexico and frankly across the United States. Because when you're dealing with your transportation providers, they more than likely are dealing with more than one commodity. The important thing is that we recognize that. We're going to continue to invest in our infrastructure. We're going to continue to invest in Mexico, and we're going to be prepared to handle the growth in the future. Thank you for letting me speak today. I look forward to answering questions later.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. I think that highlights very much exactly the title, Changing Dynamics. You can see where the shifts are going. You can see the incredible amount of investment and change that's required to deal with that. So looking forward to see how all those projects pan out and the impacts that they have. As a kind of side note, if the logistics business doesn't work out for you, you might want to think about going into light bulbs for railroads because they buy some very expensive light bulbs. I think $1.5 billion a year to turn them on. So no, but seriously, thank you for, again, outlining all those projects for us. Our last presenter before I go into the Q&A is Gary Salvador from AMPORTS.
Thank you. Bat and clean up again. Good afternoon. Like you said, Gary Salvador from AMPORTS. We're a port processor. When I got into this business, I was talking to some of my mentors, and I was talking about the old dog and the tail. And I said, you know, I know our company's not that big, but we're the tail, and we're doing business with these global OEMs, and doggone it, this time the tail's going to wag the dog. And he corrected me. He said, you're not really the tail, we're kind of the flea. We're kind of the flea on the tail of the dog. Because the tail might be these multi-million-dollar railroads and billion-dollar railroads and these truck hauler companies and the maritime companies that are in here today. So, but he was right. I've learned that he was right. And he humbled me, and that wasn't easy, but I thank you. But as that little flea, I see the port processor as the guy who can really, in the supply chain, add value to that car. We make it better. We make it faster. We can make it safer. We can do all that in a port. We can make it prettier. When I was a carrier, we focused on, let's see if I can get it from point A to point B exactly how they gave it to me. That's a high aspiration. But now, we get that car and we protect it, we accessorize it, we do all these things. We repair transit damage, though none of the providers here have ever damaged one. But if you did, we're standing by prepared in our ports to do that work for you, and as the other processors are to their own site. I've got a few slides today for 3 reasons. First and foremost, I noticed that if you don't have slides, they focus on your face. Okay? So I got a few slides. Second, thank you. You guys are a good audience. Just to show you some perspective from which we're speaking from as a port processor. Because, you know, we're a little bit different space. Other than you all, nobody else knows that we exist out in the space when they're buying a car and out there. And third, some of these slides, if I ever get arrested for being a salesman, I want to make sure they got evidence to convict me. So with that, I pressed the green button. Is that right? How about that? Beautiful. From our perspective as a port processor, you can see all those spots on the map are locations where AMPORTS runs facilities. I've seen lots of maps today, and I wish ours was more complex. In fact, we'd love to add more spots. So any of you guys that are planning your logistics change and your networks, we've got a group of people that are real good at opening up new ones. Just to point out a few highlights today, if you look at that map, one thing that sets AMPORTS apart, you see Baltimore and Benicia on the north side of each of that country, USA. We actually own those facilities and those port processing facilities. We dredge the berths, we own them, and we operate them like a port authority. So that comes with some unique opportunities for us to serve you in our owned facilities. As you move down the map, and we won't talk about all of them, but today focusing on Mexico, you can look right there at Tampa, Florida, 2.5 days from Mexico by water. Florida just surpassed New York recently as the second most populous state in the Union. So that's a pretty good gateway there. There's lots of people that live around that, and lots of cars are sold in the state of Florida. So 2.5 days away from Altamira and Veracruz, you got a great facility there open and available. As you move across the Gulf, also close to Mexico, you see Freeport. Per mentioned yesterday exciting news about opening a facility in Freeport. AMPORTS is proud to be partnering with those guys to open a facility. Texas is the second biggest state in the Union. So we believe that people are going to want to try to find a way into Texas through Freeport, and we're standing ready to take care of you. And it's an exciting opportunity, and to get to work with a partner like Hogue, who is so respected and admired by a lot of you in here, it's a treat for us, and it's exciting for us to be able to grow in that direction. On the West Coast, I mentioned Benicia is a port that we own. That's sitting right in the Bay Area. California is the most populous state in the Union. So we got gateways to where the people are, and the people are the ones buying the cars. And so we're here, to serve. This is the dots that we have today. If you look in Mexico, we've got a strong presence on the East Coast and the West Coast. Behind the plant, we heard the Toyota folks. We heard Brian yesterday talking about their new production in Salamanca. We're pleased to be a part of that with Mazda and Toyota down there. And these are good times, I've heard so many people say, to be in our business. Short C, just briefly, you can see that little space I mentioned, 2.5 days. We believe that short C is a viable and exciting alternative to get cars to the market. It's not the only alternative, and it's not even the primary alternative. But we believe that with consistent service that is there today and expected new services that will come with the growth, that it can be something you can depend on, and it can even be just a backup to what you're doing with the rail services. Because I think they said yesterday 88% of people work on diversions during our test that we took. 88% are diverting something every day. What's the cost to divert a car? What's the cost of failure if the car doesn't get there? So having a plan and a backup plan and having different modes of transportation available to you, I believe in that, and I believe that, we're here if we can help in any way along with the other folks in the room. But I think it's a great business. I think it's going to grow. Now, talking about where do we do it, this is a little bit about what do we do. We perform, I mentioned that we're the guys that can make them safer, faster, we can tune them. We can do a lot of different services in the ports, from simply IT, receiving in and out. We're connecting with most of the OEMs in the room, and that's an important part of our business and all the others in port processing, to be able to connect and share information. You can see rail unloading that we do. We're proud to be connected with some of the major Class 1 railroads here as they touch base with our ports. And so we're glad to be a part of that. Roof racks installation, just all the different types of services. Our guys are masters, and they're masters in every port that can help us with that type of business. So where do we do it? What do we do, and who do we do it for? I see at least one missing there already, but these are the folks we do business with, and some of you are missing. We'd like to get you on board that, but that's an important. Now, just some comments about the changing dynamics in North American logistics. Malcolm McLean in 1992 was starting up a new service. He's the founder of containerization here, credited as that, and he told me nothing happens until somebody makes a sale. And he told me further, he says, I woke up this morning and it was dark. I reached over, I flipped a switch, light came on, somebody started selling me electricity, and then I could start my day. So nothing could happen until somebody sold me something. But then I sat through all these presentations yesterday, and it seems a lot goes on before you sell a car. So right up until yesterday, I believed what Malcolm McLean had told me, that nothing happened until you make a sale. But now it appears that you got all these supply chain partners and inbound logistics, finished vehicle logistics, and there's so many things that happen before you sell a car. And me as a consumer, most people have no idea. So from that perspective, the work that you do is probably underappreciated out there in the world. But that was just something that struck me yesterday, that one of the things I had believed forever, maybe it's not quite right. Another saying that I've heard often, he who has the land gets the cars. Sounds simple, but I always try to tell my boss, we're not getting these cars because we have all this land. It's because I'm a super salesman, and our team is fantastic. And they said, maybe not. But yesterday there was a question. Is it capacity or is it efficiency? 85% of you said it's efficiency. So again, none of the credit goes to me, but we got a great and efficient team. All the ports, as the way they operate, what they can do, the miracles they come up with every week, every day for our customers are pretty fantastic to be a part of. Supply chain partners are investing in infrastructure. Today, I'm just seeing the numbers, and I'm in all of them. Per mentioned that the roto carriers are bringing in 49 new vessels over the next 2 or 3 years. I saw a railroad presentation. I think they said $29 billion were being spent this year on infrastructure. I'm in all of these numbers. And so to the OEMs, it's fantastic to do business with suppliers that have the wherewithal and the ability to work and make these investments, everyone from the 3PLs. And when it comes to a port, I just listed a few things there that come to mind. You've got to have improved land, buildings, car washes, body shops, accessory shops, specialized equipment and toolings and rail spurs. Even if you don't need them, somebody's going to say, do you have them? Oh, you got to check that box or you can't have any. Well, when's the last time you railed one? Well, we don't rail a lot of the inbound, but it makes us feel good. So you got to spend all that. You got to spend all that money. And as the customers require, we build the suit, and most of us in our space are that way. The other conundrum that came up when you talk about investing in new facilities, you got the new versus the old. How do I overcome? I had a port come to me and say, hey, we'd like to give you some new land. All you got to do is pave it, fence it, light it, secure it, put all your infrastructure on top, and then go get some customers. So I said, that's a great idea, and I've already got my pitch ready. Not only are we further from the berth, but we're also more expensive. And I was like, maybe that's not going to sell as well. It sounded good coming off the tongue, but at the end of the day, that's the challenge. How do we invest in infrastructure in a new port or in a new facility and then compete with a port that's been in business, like some of those I showed you earlier, for 50 years? Infrastructure is broadly paid for, amortized, and in the books. So new versus old, it's a challenge. And with the growth that we're seeing coming, people are going to need some new infrastructure and some new opportunities. So the money's, as I mentioned before, your partners are standing ready to make the investments with opportunities that come along. And it's good to be doing business in a space with healthy partners. Port, not a resort. That was, I can't say that Gary gave me that idea yesterday because I've mentioned it before, but Gary mentioned taking a port, working 2 shifts, working 3 shifts, and if you can coordinate that with the trucks and the trains and the boats, we can do a lot more in a port. But sometimes people treat the port like a resort, and the cars show up and they just bask in the Florida sun. And they, or some other state, I mean, Northern California is beautiful. So they come in, they bask in the sun, and they don't want any work done to the car. They don't want anybody to touch the car, and they don't want any accessorization on the car. And then, they eat up a lot of space. So I'm not saying that we need to work on all the cars, but I am saying that, keeping those cars moving is helpful to us, helpful to the whole supply chain process. And we like to treat them, treat our ports like ports and not necessarily like resorts. Though when you visit us, you might feel like you're at one, dealing with some of our folks and seeing the beautiful facilities. Now, an OEM not to be named may be sitting next to my boss. Said, I got all of the solution to everybody's problems. And I said, well, what is it? He said, just tell them to sell the cars before they get to the port. Because a sold car, people are in a hurry to get. And you just get them right through the port, and they'll just fly off the ground. So if any of you OEMs hadn't thought of that yet, I wanted to pass that along to you as a pearl that I got yesterday, and I hate keeping it to myself. So just sell them before you get them to the port. We'll keep them moving to the customers quickly with no damage. With that, I want to thank you, and thank you for the business and that you share with us. And one last thing, before I came here, I talked to a good friend. I said, I'm very nervous. I'm going to be speaking to lots of big executives from big companies. They said, pick out somebody that you know, admire, and respect, who's been there before and do whatever he does. So I've been watching my friend Charles, and I don't know what Charles is doing with his silverware, but I'm going to put mine back.
But wait a minute. I got the same advice, and that's why I got this.
I think that was the best presentation by a flea that I've ever seen. Thank you, Gary, for your comments and observations, and obviously for waking everybody up again back towards the end of the session before we go to lunch and have some questions. So it's, again, you see again the changing dynamics, not to repeat ourselves again and again, but we have new demand, new locations, new geographies, and there are some new locations to think about out there. I think it's a good point about the new versus the old and the challenges that we face in kind of changing things that have been done a certain way for 30, 40, 50 years. So that's some of the challenges that we certainly face ahead. Before we kind of open it up to everyone for questions, I'd like to introduce Scott Mize and also just throw the first kind of question to him, which is to perhaps reflect a little bit on what the changing dynamics have meant specifically for Nissan and the work that you're doing. Obviously, we know about a lot of capacity expansion out of Mexico, so that would be obvious. But if you can just perhaps give us an overview of kind of how you see things right now.
Certainly. The last session was the digital age, and I became a victim of the digital age about 5 minutes before this because Louis sent me a text and said, hey, can you join? And I didn't answer. And then I had my location services on, so he found where I was at. So here I am, right? So I don't really have any prepared comments, but I was lucky enough to speak in late January at the conference in Mexico, and it really was interesting to me about the infrastructure. And when we think about infrastructure and improvements and the changing dynamics of Mexico, what really was key to me was you've got to think about people because they're part of the infrastructure. You've got to think about rail cars. You've got to think about rail. You've got to think about the whole piece of it. And Mexico is a very interesting place. If you've not had much experience with the logistics there, it operates much differently, I think, than in the U.S. The rail is substantially slower. I think that we would all agree on that. Mexico City is an example where most of the majority of the vehicles are sold. The dealers can't take after-hours deliveries. You can't move trucks around. There's many, many issues that exist there that don't exist in the U.S. So when we think about our market share in Mexico, it's about 25%. The market's about 1 million units a year, and we sell 250, 260,000 units there. But we also export a substantial amount of units. And we have, and Jason, I think, put on the slide there, Aguas 2, which came online about a year and a half ago. And we have a new joint venture with Daimler and Infinity, which will be around 2017. And so to paint the picture around Aguas Calientes, there are will be three plants that produce almost 1 million cars a year out of just this one location. And it's served by the FXE Railroad and also the Kansas City Southern. I don't think either of the railroads are here. I wish they were on our panel, because it would be interesting to hear their comments and what they've had to deal with infrastructure. And back to my original comment about the Mexico conference, the government seems to be really focused on infrastructure around people, moving people around. There's improvements to the new airport that's going to be there. And when we were talking with the governmental officials, we as an auto industry were kind of like maybe second class, I would say. And I found that very interesting. So what we have to do as an OEM community, the railroad community, we've really got to push toward the government to make those infrastructure improvements. Mm.
Thanks, Scott. And Scott referenced several times there, you know, the conference that we do have now in Mexico, which we launched in January, was the first one, and which we will obviously continue to do as it gets more important. So, I mean, I do think there are some other railroads in the audience, so if they have comments that they want to contribute specifically on what's happening south of the border, we of course welcome them. And otherwise, January, you know, it's nice and warm in Mexico. It's a good time to leave Detroit or some places elsewhere in the Northeast. So keep that in mind too in future. I'd like to open up now for questions. Everyone's typically been a bit quiet. I'll have some as well. If anybody from the audience would like to comment or pose a question. Oh, right in the back corner there. Oh, sorry, then we'll come back here.
Hi, Rob Bitterman with ICL. I had a question regarding a lot of the expansion in some of these towns in Mexico. Is there a job market available to substantiate the amount of new employees?
Question on the labor. You want to take that, Scott?
Yeah, I'll take that. And it certainly had led kind of from my previous comments. That's a pretty big issue, especially as the plants really take up the space and there's limited infrastructure, people. And so we actually we run buses almost 2 hours outside of our plant locations to pick people up and bring them back to the assembly plants. So that is a real issue. Now, the workforce in Mexico is much younger than the U.S. and actually very well educated. And so that growth and the people that are there is a very wide net that has to go out to get that. That's what we experience. I don't know about Honda, if you have something similar.
Yeah, we do the same. We bus the folks, and the interesting thing with the growth is in central Mexico, you actually have a negative unemployment rate. So you have to be competitive in your salary and the treatment of people because they can get a new job tomorrow. So that's one of our challenges, is how do you keep your people, because now you have a trained line assembly person, everybody needs one.
Just to follow that, Gary, I mean, AMPORTS now has, you're doing the yard in Salamanca, and obviously you have expanded port operations. What about the labor piece for AMPORTS on the processing side?
Well, for us on the port side, maintaining and having good people has been something. We've got a lot of long-term employees. It's been easy for us in the ports to maintain excellent management and the folks. When you get behind a plant, it appears there's a little bit of a different dynamic, because in the ports, maybe I'm just competing with some other port processors like me. But when I'm at the plant, now I'm competing with an OEM for that same employee. So an OEM factory job is a slightly better job than the guy who shuttles cars or loads a rail car. So now I'm not competing, on a level playing field, let's say, against like-minded companies. Now I'm competing with guys that, like he said, zero unemployment. They're looking to suck people in. A nice place to look is right outside your front door. We got a crew out there marshaling cars and loading rail cars and staging for trucks and doing some other light work. So the challenge for us not as much in the ports, but you can see the challenges that are going to be in the back of these plants.
I was in Mexico last year speaking to another company, we don't mention now, but they mentioned how traditionally they've had 80% agency labor, and they're looking to swap that exactly around to try and build and develop the staff further. As the growth, it's just the agency isn't necessarily reliable enough. So just some of those dynamics that are changing. We had a question on the side here.
Morning, Victor Arabi with Volkswagen Group. We've been building vehicles in Puebla, Mexico since the 60s, and just recently we're moving a lot of production from Europe to Mexico. Tiguan's coming up next year. You see that San Jose Chapa, we're building the Q5. A lot of that volume is moving to Houston and Texas on rail. And obviously there's a cost of doing business to that. And I know our current railway partner is BNSF. I get a nice email every time that rail car goes over El Paso. And I'm looking at every single email to see if that rail car is damaged or has been vandalized. So I know that's a growing issue for a lot of our manufacturers, and I'd like to know from BNSF and also Jason on what are we doing or what are you doing as our rail partners to ensure safe passage of our vehicles?
Yeah, so I can't comment on Mexico specifically on and I'm not sure if Kelly's here or not, but what's going on there. From the U.S. side, one of the things I think we can do is help eliminate delays on the border. So if we can eliminate rail cars from dwelling on the border, that obviously is going to eliminate an opportunity for somebody to get into a rail car. And so I think that's one thing that on the U.S. side we can do for that fluid, smooth transition. The other thing, obviously, is if we can do inspection, we're doing inspections at the border to try to identify, what routes have the most damage, where have we seen, so if we can identify to which gateway it goes, and then, what line was it on, where did it happen, and then what did we do on our side. But from the Mexico piece, I'm not sure if anyone's here, they can talk through what's going on south of the border to do that, but it is very critical for us. It's important. We continuously are looking for opportunities because obviously a damaged vehicle or even rail car as it comes across, it's no good for anyone in the supply chain. I mean, the customers are unhappy, you're unhappy, we're unhappy. You're delaying rail cars then. So it really does interrupt the entire supply chain.
Thank you. Any comments there? Sorry, no. Any questions from? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I'll just make one comment. Certainly, and Victor, to your point, certainly there's quite a bit of damage that comes out of Mexico. We're not and I would challenge you to look at this, we're not the only industry that has those issues, such as Walmart and those, they lose container loads of things. I think that the biggest key is the speed of the rail in Mexico. Every time, as Jason said, every time it has an opportunity to stop, it gives that opportunity for it to be stolen. So. And again, I mentioned that earlier, that speed is so much of the issue there. Also, the rail network was developed through the towns, not around the towns. And so that creates a lot of issues. So that's an infrastructure issue that needs to be addressed, which can also speed up the movement of the rail cars.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Charles, I just... Since you took over the Mexico side in September, I mean, how much ability or what was the sort of strategy behind that in terms of it being run more centrally? Is there opportunity for synergies with the rest of your exports out of North America on the shipping contracts, or what was the kind of thinking behind that?
Multiple thoughts went into that. The initial one is that in most of the world is broken up by regions, and so in most other regions, exports are handled regionally versus country. And so North America historically was Canada, U.S., and Mexico all managing their own exports. And so this was, one aspect was to try to commonize the way that we do business around the world. The other piece, as with any startup company, the factory, they were really trying to focus on building cars, not so much as shipping those cars. And since we had a process in place that was pretty effective in shipping vehicles, we said, look, give us that, let us handle that for you, and you can focus on building them, and we'll get them out of there. And so far it's worked. And then also we have been able to add our volume and increase our pricing. And because of our competitors who are in Mexico, Mexico actually does offer some very affordable shipping rates, just because the volume in and out, volume from Europe gives you a pretty good deal leaving Mexico back to Europe. Again, going back to the rail is a little more challenging because, again, it's slow. There's a number, like for us at least, even to Veracruz from central Mexico, there's a stop. And so, and even though it's from Ferromex to Ferroshore, who are partners, if it dwells, and you know, you got to understand that within Mexico, I believe something like 90% of the wealth is with 1% of the population. So you can understand why that other 99% are trying to join some of this wealth. So I'm not blaming the people of the country, it's just a reality. The other thing, which is kind of a tangent on that, with all of us coming to Mexico and considering the exports, I'm really nervous about port capacity, because the ports are already pretty congested, the rails are pretty congested, and Toyota and Kia and BMW haven't even started producing. So we're hoping that the government does support the infrastructure so that we'll be able to get the vehicles out of there in the next 5 years.
Scott, I imagine it's something you're thinking about as well, with plans for 1 million vehicles just out of Aguascalientes. Do you see the balance changing at all between the amount that moves by rail versus short sea out of that location?
Well, I think that there's a huge imbalance of southbound trade from northbound trade. I don't know, I've heard 7 to 1, 8 to 1. I don't know the exact number. That creates a real problem for the rail industry, right? And repositioning rail cars and getting them located near our plant and certainly the Honda plant. I think that we're very far away from Veracruz, maybe 600 miles or so. It's not competitive to truck. It needs to be rail. And again, the port also has many issues in Veracruz, and it's not a port discussion, but certainly space, El Norte winds, all the things that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And if you were to set through the APPE's presentation, which they did speak in January, it's been recycled a couple times. So I haven't seen much growth in that, and I really don't see growth at Veracruz at this point.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Any comments, questions from the audience? Jason, obviously you indicated that you can only speak to north of the border. Obviously, that's where your network actually begins, but those interchanges are pretty critical. So, I mean, how, and the repositioning of the wagons and such, so your communication with the Mexican railways must be pretty critical. How would you sort of say that is progressing in terms of collaboration, whether on the operations or processes, systems? Can you comment to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, one of the things I can speak to immediately is, you know, we talked about the border delays and things you can do to improve interchanges. One of the luxuries we have, because we do have so many interchanges, is opening up new interchanges for multi-levels. So in 2014, we opened up Brownsville to interchange southbound multi-levels, so we weren't delaying northbound trains coming back over Laredo. With KCSM, we did similar, and we did about 10,000 multi-levels over Brownsville last year, which we hadn't done in the past. We also opened up more, with the FXE, we did the same thing. We did more over El Paso. We actually even had a few over Calexico, which is, you know, way out west. So I would say we're constantly working with both Mexican railroads on how do we get multi-levels into Mexico, where do they come from? As Scott mentioned, when you've got the imbalance, it's not like we're not sending loaded multi-levels down into Mexico to be reloaded. We're moving empty multi-levels into Mexico. So where are the multi-levels being emptied? And it's all of your demand markets, Southern California, Texas, the big demand markets. And is it the right type of vehicle going into those markets that then that multi-level needs to get to Mexico? So is it a bi-level or tri-level? Which plant does it go to? So we're constantly doing that, where we're working at opening up new interchanges as well.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Any questions from the floor? Okay, and Gavin and Brad, if you see and I don't, please just grab because I can't. There was a question actually on the live feed which comes from Richard Frick. He says, I haven't heard anything from OEMs about long-term contracts to facilitate mega expenditures. Is this a partnership or a service grab? We did actually hear from, in our session yesterday, some stuff about Glovis wanting to do longer-term contracts and Toyota saying that they have gone to them. But perhaps in the context of Mexico or in exports to new areas, have you considered or are you looking at longer-term contracts than had been normal?
On behalf of Honda, yes. In fact, we just did a vessel RFP, and the tenders were all multi-year contracts, and not only to enable the suppliers to finance, but for me, I'd rather be shipping vehicles than negotiating on how much it's going to cost me to ship them. So if we can partner on that, then next year or the year after that, I don't have to waste my time negotiating. We can just keep moving vehicles. So that is the plan, and we have long-term contracts with our processors, our vessel companies, and we're working on that across the board.
Yeah, from Nissan's perspective, certainly we value a long-term contract and the relationship. I think Glenn Cliff mentioned that earlier in one of his presentations, that he's not trying to move away from suppliers, but we have plus 5-year contracts throughout our network in North America.
Okay. I don't know if on the provider side you want to comment on any.
Yeah, I think from our standpoint, we obviously we've talked a lot about forecasting and stability. The farther out that we know we're going to have business and we can invest back into it. You don't build a multi-level overnight. You don't put in a new siding in or a new yard or change infrastructure, distribution facility overnight. So we're always looking to partner longer term with the OEMs so that we can continue to invest in the business.
I'd say too, as a service provider, we enjoy 3-year, 5-year contracts, some longer. We have some that are evergreen, that once a year they might take a look and agree to the new set of rates and services and CPI type increases. So we've got contracts across the board, but not exactly the kind of contracts the railroads get. Ours don't necessarily have a volume guarantee, so to speak. Somebody tells me how many they're going to plan to move, but they don't necessarily guarantee they're going to move them. And so it's kind of a unique situation, but also over the term of our company, even though OEM can get out of one, we don't have any track record of anybody getting out of an agreement, in the middle of the term or halfway through. People, we honor our contracts, and so do our customers. And 3 and 5 years is the norm.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Obviously, we're talking a lot about Mexico, but as we have indicated, that the demand growth is here, and there has been other capacity expansions. So, Scott, maybe to start with you, in terms of out of Canton and Smyrna, for example, have you seen any other? What kind of logistic challenges have you seen in terms of changing dynamics there? Can you continue to have rail issues or truck capacity, driver? Have you had to make any adjustments?
Yeah, certainly. I think probably all OEs are not immune to this, right? If the rail is not running at the speed that TTX kind of predicted the model should run at, and the vehicles are not being unloaded in a timely fashion, carriers not moving them away, then we have issues. So I think that the dynamic model, which I know is being studied, being looked at, is certainly something that I would be in favor of, and we have a team that works on that through the Alice Group. So,
yeah, thank you. And Charles, let's have a question right here in the audience. Yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian Deegans here. Question: Mexico is clearly becoming a big production area. I haven't really heard anything about the TPP and its effect there. I'd like to know whether you see opportunities for Mexico expanding more into exports from North America to some of the other countries where maybe there were tariff barriers before. So what do you potentially see as changes coming with new trade agreements? Obviously, NAFTA was brought up here quite a few times, but that has been in place for a while. So what do you project in terms of changes going forward for Mexican production?
Well, I'd have to say most of the time we're praying. And more importantly, initially to other Latin American countries, because some Latin American countries are not necessarily friends with Mexico. And so it's kind of interesting when you have to figure out how to do it. Like if you pick Brazil, there's quotas. So we could sell a lot more cars in Brazil if Brazil and Mexico had a better agreement. But, and then you have a time frame to get them in, so you're rushing trying to ship these cars to meet that deadline, and it's kind of interesting. And the funny story we just went through talking about the dynamics, we're negotiating with our distributor in Brazil when we're going to move these cars and how we're going to move and on what days, and so we finally come to an agreement. And that particular day, the federales and the cartel had a shootout in Guadalajara, so we couldn't move the cars anyway. So then we had to go back and talk to the Brazilian government and say, can we get a force majeure and move these things a little late? So what do I see in the future? I'm hoping that the Mexican government will work with some of these other countries and create better FTA agreements. Also with us exporting to Europe, it's kind of funny because, in order to meet their requirements, you got to have enough content. Otherwise, your duty is amazing. And we go through some interesting things to make that content. So, for instance, we manufacture parts in Mexico. We ship them to Europe. Europe builds an engine. We send the engine back to Mexico, put it in the car, and then we export the car to Europe. So it's interesting. So if these agreements were a little more flexible, we wouldn't have to do all the song and dance to build a car, which increases the cost. And we're going to start with Asia in the fall, and I don't know at this point how that's going to look out of Mexico. We also have another issue from Mexico, from Canada south. And how do you do that? Do you bring the car through the U.S., and if you do you have to put it in bond, or would it be better to short see it around? And so we're dealing with those types of things on a daily basis. And at this point, most of that's going to be on the Mexican government. And I don't, I think if I had to pick, I'd rather ask them for better railroad structure than I would for free trade agreements.
I would agree. I don't have a lot of detail to talk to that question. I apologize for that. But to the earlier point, and you saw in Jason, he showed the worldwide map, and as the OEs, they look at where that they can source the vehicles with the least costs, and certainly Mexico is one of those. China's a huge market for sure as far as growth, like 31 million, I think, SAR. I think that could be an opportunity for Mexico's export, but again, it would lead, Mexico's government would need to really lead that initiative.
When we had our conference and we had the Secretary of the Economy speaking, he did highlight that Asia is now the focus in terms of trade for Mexico, in terms of getting those agreements and building those relationships. They are quite far behind, admittedly. So there are developments there. But I think it's a good point. You could have all these trade agreements in place, but if the bandidos get in the way, then I guess, it can be moot. But on that kind of point, I mean, perhaps we can just have maybe the last question, unless something else comes from the audience, on the security issues, in terms of what perhaps some strategies that Nissan, if we can start with, has done to protect vehicles, be they within Mexico or when they're being moved through. Are there any kind of measures that you would speak to, Scott, that have been effective or not effective?
Well, and we would look to the rail industry in Mexico to kind of lead those. Certainly there's been a lot of things that have been done around the rail car itself to try to secure the doors. I think that you guys were maybe taking those off in El Paso because there were some issues in the U.S. And so those were some kind of countermeasures that were put in place. But I think that the real key is the infrastructure and the speed, and that's what we have to really focus on, and that's what our goal has been, is to try to improve the infrastructure in Mexico to keep the rail cars moving, because that seems to be the way to really stop the damage issues. Because if it's moving, they can't get into the rail cars.
That's easy.
Unless there's a final question, I think that's probably, no, I think you're all ready for lunch. Well, I want to thank our panel first for their presentations, their time, their flexibility, and the questions. Gary's going to be able to bring his silverware straight to lunch. Can I just, for those of you with us yesterday, lunch is in a slightly different place today. It's the amphitheater, which, if for those of you who are at the cocktail reception, it's that area. But go back through the hotel, through the lobby, and then turn right. We'll guide you there. But please join us there. And I think the June gloom maybe have burned off a bit by now, so sunglasses, suntan lotion, whatever you need to join us.